Thobela. We are just about to start. Mematlare, where I'm standing, I may not be able to see when they come, but I think somebody will indicate for me. Molo, Abusheni, Ndimacheroni, Ndimatekwana, Dumelang, Thobela, Goyenand. My name is Edith Paswana, and I'm going to be your facilitator, your program director this evening. I'm not on my own. I am with Professor Mutuku Mohale, and he's the Executive Dean of the Economic and Management Sciences here at Unisa, and I am the director at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. Please change that to Mali Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. We are now called the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, and we are just about to start. Before we start, I think we have a video, but I wanted the video to play when everyone else is here. I think we can start. Is there anyone with a good voice to start a song? You know? I wish I was able to sing. So Nakia Vimba. So I'm a bimbist of note, so I can't even start a song. But it would be nice for us to have a music or something as we wait for the dignitaries to join us. Do you have music there? I will appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm going to rely on you as I see them, you standing up, it means they are entering. They are coming. We are just about to start now. Oh, nice.
We can relax.
Keep standing. We are going to sit for a long time, for more 2 hours. So maybe it's good that we are standing. We keep standing now. I wish I could say, please be seated, but I know. No, I'm not saying. I say I wish. I wish I could say that, but we are waiting for Her Excellency to appear, so. Meva iyahlaba yokuthanda inameva iyahlaba sukuthanda sukuthanda Okay, thank you very much for breaking the monotony. Let's welcome the Vice Chancellor and Principal of Unisa, and Her Excellency, the Vice President of Liberia. A warm round of applause. And the Deputy Minister of Higher Education. Welcome. Now, this one is real. You may be seated. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Madam Vice Chancellor, allow me to acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Minister, Honorable Buti Manamela, members of the Unisa Council present here this evening, Madam Vice Chancellor and Principal of Unisa, Professor Pulenlen Kabula, members of the University of Management of Unisa, members of the Diplomatic Corps in attendance here, distinguished guests, colleagues, students and alumni of the university, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm just waiting for people to get seated here in the front. Thank you. Welcome to the 2022 Acclaimed Founders Lecture and Vice Chancellor's Gala Dinner at the University of South Africa, or the University of the Land, as our students will say. My name is Edith Paswana, and I'm based at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm going to be one of your program directors this evening. And I'm not alone, I'm with Professor Matuku Mohali here, and you'll see him as he comes to the podium. Professor Matuku Mohali is the Executive Dean of Economic and Management Sciences here at the Unisa. We are gathered here this evening to celebrate an important lecture in the calendar of the university. The idea of a founder's lecture was introduced at the University of South Africa in 2003. The aim is to encourage the university community and its stakeholders to focus on critical issues facing the higher education sector nationally and globally. Over the past 9 years, we have managed to focus on a variety of topics delivered by eminent and renowned scholars from across the continent and the globe. Unisa established the Founders Lecture as a premium forum for high-level intellectual engagement. We are honored this evening to continue this tradition in the person of Her Excellency, Madam Ms. Jewel Howard Taylor, Vice President of Liberia, who will deliver the 2022 Founders Lecture under the broad theme of the realization of the African Renaissance through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Tonight, we are hosting one of our eminent leaders and daughter of the soil on the African continent, Her Excellency. She will be delivering the lecture under the theme, as I've already said, realization of the African Renaissance through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And as we know that the realization of African Renaissance is one of the pertinent struggles on the continent, and in it lies Africa's solutions to its problems and also its possibilities as a global leader. So this year, as we know, Africa also turns 20, the African Union is turning 20, so this is a good time to celebrate the Founders Lecture with our eminent leader on the continent. So we know that there are several achievements that we have achieved and that we can take stock of in terms of the AU, and one of them being exactly the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The journey towards the African Renaissance actually has to grapple with issues of economy, issues of education, because the AfCFTA remains one of the instruments that has the potential to usher a united Africa for all of us. And as we know, it is based on the assumption that the past and previous model of reliance on raw material exports on the continent is not sustainable, and we know, we have seen it. Also, a continental free trade area has the capability to foster industrialization and overall structural transformation on the continent. Again, we know that Africa is home to over 1 billion people with large deposit of mineral resources, energetic and talented people. So, and it is also home to some of the fastest growing economy in terms of GDP. We have a rising middle class. I think if you read the report of African Development Bank, you also have to see that. The high rate of poverty and inequality, and all of these factors makes this African continental free area a very important subject to deliberate on this year. The university, as we know, also remains one of the sites of ideation globally and one of the historical institutions that we have on this continent. We will remember that prior to 15th century, Africa had leading universities in Egypt, in Morocco, and Mali. And for centuries, Africa has been striving to re-emerge from the shackles of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and wars. This can be seen even in the types of scholars that Africa has produced over time. And we will also remember that more recently we had outstanding universities on the continent, Dar es Salaam School, the Makerere School, and the Ibadan School, and many others that you can think of. But today, as you look at the continent, you begin to realize that state politics are also permeating the university space at very unprecedented levels, in such a way that there is a thin line between intellectual and politicians. And also, this conversation could not have happened at a critical time in our country and on our continent. Scholars such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Pixley Kaseme laid the foundation for African Renaissance, a theme which was later embraced fully by our very own Chancellor and former President of South Africa, His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki. Mbeki became the champion of African Renaissance, and today African Renaissance is more associated with him than any other leader on the continent. So as we will know, the African Renaissance is not a once-off struggle with a particular timeline. It's an ongoing process which contemporary Africans continue to deliberate on, particularly as they think about the vision for their continent. And as we have observed over the years, education and the economy are some of the vital systems in the struggle for the regeneration of Africa. And Ndlovu Agajeni has actually summed this in a chapter dedicated to African Renaissance in his book, Decolonization, Development, and Knowledge in Africa, which was published by Routledge in 2020. And I quote, "The epistemic crisis in the continent continues to compromise the struggle for Africa's renewal." In the past, we have had outstanding men and women of high intellect deliberating on very topical issues. To take you through to take you through the history of this Founders Lecture, we are going to play a video now that you can look at and see some of the best scholars, some of the best leaders on the continent who have stood up on this podium to deliberate on these matters.
It's an honor for me to have this unique opportunity to visit Unisa, one of the oldest universities on the African continent that is still breaking boundaries and doing some of the most amazing things with the young people. The University of Liberia is looking forward to having a relationship with Unisa so that we can further the interests that have been a part of our history for a long time. Liberia and South Africa go back a very long way. And we're now moving from a community of states to a community of people. There are many South African business people who have come to Liberia. There are many Liberians living here. So I want to first of all thank the Vice Chancellor and the Unisa family for inviting me to this Founders Day event. We look forward to a more robust relationship over the next few years. Who knows? But I want to say happy 150th birthday in advance to Unisa. I know next year will be your 150th birthday anniversary. And it's 150 years of great and amazing things. I know the next 50 years will take us beyond what we even expect. So thank you for inviting me. I'm truly honored to be here.
I'm truly privileged to have the opportunity to share with you what transpired just today. We are honored to have Madam Jewel Howard-Taylor, the Vice President of the Republic of Liberia, joining us to deliver the Founders Lecture, a flagship program of the University of South Africa. I'm thankful to the university management, the knowledge communities, for ensuring that this is going to be a delightful event where Africa imagines its future, looks at possibilities and areas of collaboration such that the imagination, dreams, knowledge systems, and future can be thought about together.
Thank you very much. We are honored this evening. As Unisa, we feel extremely honored to host Her Excellency, Madam Ms. Jewel Howard Taylor, the Vice President of South Africa, as we continue with this tradition. Oh, of Liberia. You are our next president, Her Excellency. Of Liberia, thank you so much. Thank you. I beg your pardon. I wanted to say the Vice President of Liberia. South Africa was on my tongue, always. At this point in time, I am going to invite our Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Bulen Lenkabula, to come and do the opening and welcome. Madam VC, over to you.
Good evening. Sanbonani, Dumelang, Lord Chani, Goeienaand, Boa noite. So, Professor Paswan, don't worry about the tongue twister. I heard Madam Vice President said, no, you are very progressive and forward-looking. South Africa needs a deputy president who's a woman. So I think that was the future orientation. Program Director, Professor Edith Paswana from Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute at the University of South Africa. Professor Matugu Mohale, the Executive Dean of College of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of South Africa, our program directors tonight. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this important work. Let me, colleagues, recognize the presence of Her Excellency Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor, the Vice President of the Republic of Liberia. Can I request a round of applause? Dr. Ruel Khoza, Chancellor of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, distinguished thought leader and a businessman. Our Deputy Minister of Higher Education, Science and Technology, Mr. Buti Manamela. We're very excited to have you, sir. Ms. N.G. Howard, Deputy Minister of Health in the Republic of Liberia, present here this evening. His Excellency Ambassador Professor Iqbal Jazbai, who is the current Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to Liberia. All Excellencies, Ambassadors, High Commissioners present this evening, the Vice Chancellor of the Acting Vice Chancellor or Vice President and Executive Dean of the Graduate Studies and Research at the University of Liberia, Dr. Jonathan Taylor, members of the Diplomatic Corps representing various countries in South Africa, Mr. M. Chilani, MEC in the Department of Education, members of the University Council, members of University Management present herein. I recognize Professor Mutsa, Mr. Mutebele, Ms. Nakene, Professor Meiwa, and all other management members of MENCOM here tonight. Let me also recognize the extended management of the University of South Africa, as well as Senate and Senex members participating in person and virtually, the Student Representative Council of the University of South Africa. I recognize some of the leaders to my left, and we appreciate that you're here. I could see Ms. Poshoko around. Let me also recognize representatives from national, provincial, local, political parties, business communities, research institutes, institutions of higher learning, various organizations and foundations who have honored the invitation tonight. Let me also recognize the CEO designate of the Human Sciences Research Council of our country, Professor Muswetsa, who's also a member of council, having recognized Dr. Musia, the Deputy Chair of Council. Equally important colleagues have been requested to therefore request to acknowledge Professor Dek Gotse, Professor of Political Sciences at the University of South Africa, Professor Meahabo Makhanu, Professor of Education at the University of South Africa, and Mr. Kaya Sitole, who has gladly agreed to also be the respondent. Members of the media, esteemed invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, Khotsong, Sanibonani, good evening. I'm truly privileged to welcome you all to the 2022 Founders Lecture this evening. The 2022 theme for this year has already been shared by Professor Paswane, referring to this idea about the realization of the African Renaissance through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You'd realize that this topic tries to ensure that the historicity and the actions towards emancipation through the dreams, aspirations, and knowledge arenas of the forebears of African leadership who dreamed of liberation in the political sphere, who agitated for the dignity and the possibilities of Africa's shaping its civilization, has become an important imperative to find expression in our socio-economic, ecological, and liberation aspects. The idea of the Founders Lecture, as has been stated, has really been for universities to understand, to grapple with the grand challenges and opportunities that universities can partner with societies in order to find solutions, but to humanize worlds, especially worlds that have been defined by fragmentation, oppression, wars, violence, negation of the humanity of each other, or even the negligence of living with peace and flourishing with the cosmic environment. This is quite important because the continent of Africa has bequeathed humanity its being. Those who go to the Stekfontein caves or Maruping, or if you go to Ethiopia, we know that paleontology or paleoanthropology reminds us that this continent requires us to be attentive to the movements of people into other continents, and therefore to the movements of knowledge systems as we try to live with each other. Since its establishment in 2003, the Founders Lecture has attracted very diverse, finest thinkers of our times, many of whose work reverberate across generations for their grappling with what is the meaning of knowledge or education. Is it just to separate us from our communities? Is it to allow the status quo to remain? Or is the function of education to creating intellectuals whose moral agency invites them to imagining, but also to actively participating in the changes required in order that the world becomes a vibrant, liberating environment for our lives? The speakers of the Founders Lecture have already been shared with you, and therefore I'd not go through them again. But it is important for me to note that they are as diverse as the flowers, rivers, mountains that our Chancellor, President Beki, has talked about. They grapple with the questions of science, with the relevance of higher education, at a time when higher education in Africa was being hollowed and only basic education was seen as an important imperative. It also questions whether Timbuktu, Fez universities and their models of being the first universities in the world still resonate with the future that Africa would like to determine for itself as it engages with its friends all over the global north and the global south. Program directors, on behalf of the University of South Africa, it truly gives me a sense of exhilaration that we have been honored by the company of Her Excellency, the Vice President of Liberia, Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor, a true daughter of the soil and whose remarkable dedication and commitment to the upliftment of children, of societies, of women, of repositioning our continent in the changing world cannot be contested. I'm truly appreciative that as we engage and listen deeply with the presentation and the lecture of Dr. Howard Taylor, that we remember the political histories, not histories, histories of our continent. For oftentimes, the histories of the continent are buried underneath, even though they've been the bellies, but also the anchor for the emancipation project, even as we celebrate men, young boys and girls, and the different communities of the continent. Amimna Mama reminds us that it is a well-established fact that women who were actively involved in the early and mid-20th century nationalist struggles that led to the independence and the establishment of modern states are often not in the textbooks that we in universities use for teaching, and it's about time that we reimagine inclusive epistemologies. She states that the ensuing period has seen a lot of women's work, feminists, their partners and friends, who now agitate that the state structures and systems that women were at the center and continue to be at the center of forming must be lifted up, celebrated, written about, and wherein we're able, we must find those women and ensure that they speak with their own voices so that we understand their positionality, but also their commitments to the continent and to the global world. Our keynote speaker this evening is not only visible as an engaged stateswoman, she's not only Her Excellency who is sitting in a position of responsibility, but she optimizes her strong voice for gender equality, for advocacy for affordable and quality education, as well as a crusader for public accountability and systems that are responsive. Your Excellency, it is indeed a great pleasure for all the knowledge communities of the University of South Africa, as well as the general public, including our diplomatic corps, to really know in the annals of continent history or histories that the leading source of knowledge production and engaged scholarship, particularly at this point in the moment in the history of humankind, are the roles that universities must play in this era, whether it's on questions of climate change, pandemics, digital revolutions, scientific discoveries, poverty and conflict, that we must engage with governments as we do with transnational or local companies to look at how we can harness the resources available so that the research of Africa is also at the center of policy systems and advisory. Back in 1963, President Kwame Nkrumah opens his book title, Africa Must Unite. It is reverberated by an African in the diaspora singing beautifully the melodic chanting that if we do not unite, and reminding us with the last country that got its liberation, Zimbabwe, that if our unity is not strengthened, we will forever be holding the begging bowl. Bob Marley reminds us. And in this, President Nkrumah says, the winds of change are blowing through Africa is no ordinary wind. It is a raging hurricane against which the older order cannot stand. And later, when he comments on the Pan-African unity, he says there are those who maintain that Africa cannot unite because we lack the necessary ingredients for unity, a common race, culture, and language. Yet in spite of this, I'm convinced that the forces making for unity far more outweigh those which divide us. And this is the question that our own president, President Mbeki, our own former president, our own chancellor now, President Mbeki, has highlighted. Colleagues, President Mbeki, our chancellor then, in his African Renaissance speech in 1998, he really invites us to this rebirth of the continent, our own rediscovery of ourselves, how we can overcome the ideas that we just have to borrow others' ideas. He reminds us about the pyramids of Egypt, the stone buildings of Aksum, the ruins of Carthage and Zimbabwe, the rock paintings of the Seine, the Benin bronzes, and many other aspects of Africa's knowledge civilizations that call for a renewal. And finally, because I'm not the one who's delivering the Founders Lecture, colleagues, it's very important that he reminds us that we must rebel against ordinary criminals who murder, rape, and rob and conduct war in our countries, in our continent, and in the global arena, in order that knowledge and the ordinary people on the poorest continent should embrace higher education as a route out the debilitating deprivations that we contend with. And 6 years later, the General Secretary of the AFCFTA, Mr. Wamkele Mene, who was here at Unisa in August, has reminded us that the relevance of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is even more important now, for because we as Africans cannot even visit each other using our own airlines, our own borders, our own cars, our own horse carts. And it's about time that we recreate that dependency. He says, by providing a large and attractive market with reduced cross-border barriers, investors can undertake larger revenue projects on a regional rather than national scale. The AFCFTA, therefore, offers an apt response to the reluctance of investors to invest in small, fragmented, and uncompetitive national markets. Although almost all African countries have managed to unshackle themselves from the yoke of colonialism and the heinous systems that have not allowed our liberations to be meaningful in the economic domain. Although the liberation of our countries has become manifest, the ideas of the economic and ecological transformations are quite fundamental. I'm confident that we will learn a lot more from listening to the much-awaited lecture by Her Excellency Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor, who I'm still pinching myself in disbelief that we were able to secure your presence, understanding your manifest and manifold responsibilities. I'm actually aware that through the harsh legacy, sophisticated systems left behind, that the continued struggles require us to collaborating even as universities, as countries, as businesses, but also to creating trajectories that facilitate critical conversations through our ability to convene great thinkers, great leaders of society, and to also share community with those in the global south and global north so that university can be meaningful. I'm certain that we will leave this place tonight, this university, the University of the Land, as Professor Paswana has already stated, the University of Society, the university where leaders are formed and leaders who are committed to humanizing world. Welcome to Unisa, the University of the Land, the home of leaders, a place of imagining the future where we can all theorize, connect with practice, and ensure that we contribute positively to the world. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chancellor, for this thoughtful introduction and opening. I think you have highlighted and alluded to the challenges of erasure of women on the continent, particularly higher stories. And as we rewrite and reimagine African futures, I think we cannot continue in this trajectory of invisibilizing African women, especially in the knowledge arena. We are privileged this evening to have our very own Deputy Minister, Honorable Mr. Buti Manamela, probably the most visible face in this sector. Motlhaloga, you have become the face of higher education. I think at every university that I go, I see you. I see you representing the higher education sector. And we are really, really honored to have you here tonight to usher and introduce Her Excellency, our guest speaker, our lecturer, this evening. Over to you, Motlhaloga.
Thank you, Dr. E, Program Director. I won't give you a lecture about the lecturer. I'll just go straight into the simple task of introducing her, which is my greatest honor. Our guest speaker, Her Excellency Chief Dr. Joel Howard Taylor, who I, as indicated, have the distinct honor of introducing. Chief Dr. Joel Howard Taylor was the First Lady of Liberia from 1997 to 2003. She founded and led the National Humanitarian Task Force to provide food, humanitarian, and medical services to thousands of Liberians who were displaced because of the civil war. One of the greatest legacies in the creation is, one of her greatest legacies in the creation of the Ministry of Gender, which is today the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. Between 1996 and 1997, she also served as Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Liberia. Okay. The lecture about the lecturer is proving to be okay. One of her greatest legacies is the creation of the Ministry of Gender, which is today the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. And between 1996 and 1997, she served as Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Liberia, which is now the Central Bank of Liberia. and as president of the Agriculture Cooperative Bank. Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor is also an accomplished academic with a lot of meritorious achievement. She holds a BSc in Economics, Masters in Banking, honors graduate, an MBA in Finance, honors graduate, an LLB in Law, honors graduate, a postgraduate diploma in International Relations, honors graduate, and an honorary doctorate degree in Leadership and Governance. Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor is also a visible and engaged stateswoman with a strong voice for gender equality, advocacy for affordable and quality education, a fair and transparent justice system, the improvement of accessible healthcare system, improved women's economic and political participation, and an accountable public service system, amongst others. She is one of Liberia's foremost advocates for increased and improved opportunities for women of Liberia and Africa and is now being called the Jewel of Africa. She has received many awards, including the Pan-African Award on Leadership Excellence and Women Empowerment. Her Excellency also holds the distinction of being the first woman to be given the traditional title of Venerable Chief of the National Traditional Council of Liberia in 2011. This a chieftaincy title conferred on her by traditional chiefs and elders of Bong country for her role in sponsoring a bill which created the National Traditional Council of Liberia, and in recognition of her exemplary services to the people of Bong County in Liberia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my greatest and singular honor that I present to you and invite to the podium our guest speaker for tonight, Her Excellency Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor. If we may rise and a round of applause.
Please have your seats. I'm not sure who he introduced, but I think I'm just a woman who wants so much more that Africa can give us. So each of us have to pull our own weights. I'm really honored to be here. His Excellency, former President Thabo Mbeki, Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and head of the Mbeki Foundation, Excellencies, special honored guests, chairpersons and members of the Unisa Council, our Vice Chancellor, who has so warmly received me today, the administration and faculty of Unisa, Her Excellency, Madam Ethel Davis, Ambassador of Liberia to the Republic of South Africa, who's sitting there in the front, His Excellency Professor Igba Jabe, Ambassador of South Africa to Liberia, other distinguished guests, the Unisa family, students, members of the business community, members of the Fourth Estate, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I was truly honored to have been given this opportunity, to have been invited to this prestigious citadel of learning. For this, I am truly grateful. But I want to give praise to the Almighty God, who is the arbiter of human life, for his faithfulness and unfailing love towards my delegation and I, who traveled all the way from Monrovia here to Pretoria. We are truly grateful. I must also give thanks and appreciation to the Chancellor, His Excellency, former President Thabo Mbeki, who is not here this evening, but I know his involvement in the lecture series and here at the university, and I'm just honored to have an opportunity
to come and visit where he is making major inroads and continuing the vision that he set many years ago. To the Vice Chancellor, the principal and members of the council, and the organizer of this annual Founders Lecture, thank you for having me come and visit and participate in this very, very, very prestigious lecture series. When I got the invitation from the ambassador of South Africa to Liberia, I was a little bit twisted about what to do about it. But I knew I wouldn't miss this opportunity to come and spend a little time here, knowing that the rewards that I would have gotten as a result of my engagements here would just enrich me to be more of what I can be. I'm truly, truly grateful. It would be remiss of me were I not to give special recognition to the South African ambassador accredited to Liberia, who has become not just a diplomat in my country, but a true friend. For beginning a conversation we started a few months ago, and I thought maybe 2 years or 3 years down the road. But he reminded me of the importance of the relationship between both countries and peoples of both countries. Thankfully, after a few conversations back and forth about this, I'm finally here. Thank you so much. This visit for me is a little bittersweet because in the span of my life's journey of almost 60 years, my deepest desire was to visit here one day and meet Madiba, Nelson Mandela, and Winnie Mandela. As a young child, I heard the stories of both of them, one being incarcerated and silenced for fighting for freedom for his people, and the other a strong female voice of liberation, a voice against apartheid and the free Nelson Mandela movement. The sounds from South Africa reverberated across the nations of our continent. And thankfully, where I was in my little neck of the woods in Liberia, I wasn't left out. My father would listen to the radio in the evenings and we would hear about the things happening here. Today, a lot of that has changed, and South Africa has come together, united, working together for the greatness that this country is. But what remained with me from those early years was a strong, powerful voice. And in the 50s and 60s, women were silent, especially in my part of the world. They would attend meetings, but they won't speak. And to hear a voice from all the way down here, loudly, clearly, without fear or favor, she became my first female role model. And I'm grateful. Though my wish to meet both icons was never fulfilled, today I have a unique opportunity to walk upon this land, which nurtured and groomed them. But not just Winnie Mandela and Madiba, many, many, many other great African leaders. Your history makes all of us proud of the men and women who have come out of the liberation struggle and worked across the nations of the world, bringing to our minds the need for peace, the need for collaboration, the need for the greatness that Africa is. Your Excellency, Madam Vice Chancellor, Excellencies, special honored guests, the Unisa family, I want to bring you warm greetings from my president, His Excellency President George Manewia, from the government of Liberia and our people, on whose behalf I extend fond congratulations and best wishes to the Unisa family for the hosting of this 2022 Founders Day lecture. Especially when you look back at the intent of this annual August gathering, which is to bring together and spotlight critical issues not only about academia, its pursuits and possibilities, but to also focus on the global trends which affect the trajectory of academia, governance, cooperation, and international development, amongst others. The mindset behind this gathering has set the trend for the annual Founders Day lecture, as stated in the Unisa code, from which I like to quote, that it is to contribute to the knowledge and information society, to advance development, to nurture a critical citizenry, and ensure African and global sustainability. From this important vantage point, it is of no surprise to many that UNISA's Founders Day lecture is a sought-after event. It is a forum for progressive thoughts, extensive debates and discussions, oftentimes finding itself as the trajectory for democracy, economic projection, and development, not just here in South Africa, but across the continent and the world at large. Can we clap for the UNISA family for this important event? When you dig a little deeper into UNISA's curriculum policy, it further explains why such a forum is important. And I like this one: to promote African thought, philosophies, interests through inquiry, scholarship, research, cooperation, and partnership. So it's not leaving the continent behind, it's not leaving South Africa behind. It's bringing out the greatness of who we are as Africans. All of these introspections culminate into a testament which boasts of critical lecture topics and the many prominent lecturers who have stood on this dais, as we saw earlier. As I looked at the list of prominent individuals who have stood here before me, I was a little nervous. Though this is an auspicious occasion for me and a very special one, the list is quite impressive. And I wondered how I would stand here today and leave my footprints. I hope my lecture will bring to bear a new sense of urgency and action to the need for self-actualization across our continent, a vision that is most attainable sooner rather than later. Your Excellency, Madam Vice Chancellor, Excellency, special honor guests, before I begin this lecture, permit me a moment to bring into our remembrance the historical linkages between the Republic of Liberia and South Africa, which has spanned many, many, many decades. Of all of the memorable moments that came to my mind as I remembered our rich history, the one which stands out include the period during the years of the apartheid liberation struggle, where Liberia's then President William V.S. Tubman played a leading role. He publicly advocated for more than just a just society. He spoke about the need for others to join the fight against apartheid, elimination of colonialism, but self-actualization for the people of our continent. This relationship branded our capital city, Monrovia, as a fertile location for progressive discourse. And many, many, many freedom fighters found themselves in Monrovia for advice, for assistance, and for a forward-thinking way, because we didn't just want one country liberated, we wanted the entire continent liberated. Because of President Tubman's stance on the trending issues of the day, he played host to many freedom fighters, including the late Oliver Tambo, then president of the ANC, and Madiba Nelson Mandela. These interactions moved those great men of that time beyond mere friendships to true brotherhood and created a close bond between Liberians and South Africans, which exists today. It can be recalled in recent history that South Africa was quite instrumental in helping to resolve the Liberian civil crisis. As mediators, providers of human, material, and financial resources, even to the place of allowing soldiers to join the South African Defense Force, which formed a part of the African Union and United Nations peacekeeping contingent deployed in Liberia. Thankfully, this role played during this period had a significant impact, not only on ending our crisis, but ensuring a peaceful resolution for our country. Of particular mention is a constructive role played by then President of South Africa, President Thabo Mbeki, who personally visited Liberia many times. But his last visit during August of 2003, when our crisis was at its highest peak, provided a calm to the situation and allowed the peace process to be settled. His presence in Monrovia, along with other leaders from West Africa, brought the peace process to fruition. He personally intervened and supported all of the different initiatives needed for paving the way for a transitional government and subsequently democratic elections in 2005. To state it succinctly, it was African leadership in the midst of African crisis that restored calm and culminated into the election of the first democratically elected president, female president of Liberia and Africa, Her Excellency, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. The Republic of South Africa has remained engaged with the Republic of Liberia in many ways since then. They were the first nation to provide post-conflict medical and humanitarian support during the critical years of the Ebola virus and also during COVID-19 pandemic. This kind gesture was again repeated recently as the Republic of South Africa, through its Ministry of International Cooperation, provided vaccines for our coronavirus program, daring yet again, beyond the ordinary, to share its limited supply of vaccines for the well-being of citizens of a sister republic. Can we clap for the Republic of South Africa, please? Thank you. Today, both nations continue to build on that foundation of peaceful coexistence and cooperation. And I know with the presence of Dr. Jonathan Taylor and other members of the Liberian delegation, we are about to start a whole new process with Unisa. We look forward to a robust engagement that will bring the two universities even closer. Let me, before I leave this point, say a very special thank you to President Cyril Ramaphosa and the government and the people of South Africa for not looking inward and agreeing to be a part of the processes that I just explained. We are truly grateful. And on behalf of my president, President George Manawia, our people, and in my own name, I say a very, very, very profound thank you. Let me just for a moment give special recognition to His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki for his stellar leadership during the Liberian conflict, as I said earlier. His personal intervention went a long way, not only just for the cessation of crisis, but he granted my family and I a soft landing, even offering his nation, South Africa, as one of the places for consideration for a home away from home. In hindsight, I can say that these actions provided a lifeline for our family. But because of his efforts in assisting to fine-tune the Liberian peace accords, when I eventually was able to return home in 2004, I, who had been exiled, was given an opportunity to participate in the 2005 presidential and general elections, an opportunity that opened new doors to continue to contribute to my beloved nation. A process by which, through the grace of God, I was propelled into politics, elected in the national legislature twice, as senator of the third largest constituency in my country, and today I stand here as the first female vice president of Liberia. Your Excellency, Madam Vice Chancellor, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that being said, let me try and begin the task for which I was invited. But I had to say that thank you. Little did I know I would be standing here today, and it's good to say that you appreciate the little things that people do that make a world of difference at the continental level, at the national level, and in individual lives. The lecture is the realization of the African Renaissance through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. As this is a setting for academia, there are some words that I believe people already are aware of. The African Renaissance, a philosophical movement intended to change the trajectory of where our continent is going. And the need to look at the kind of leadership needed to mobilize and to inspire others to go in a particular direction. And the new paradigm that is necessary for Africa to come of age. In consideration of the context of the dynamics of the global world, the new phenomenon of digitalization, but the stark reality of our interconnectivity and interdependence has made it critical to have a closer look at our continent and its interactions, both internally, externally, and globally, thus bringing to bear the need to look at options for Africa's political, democratic, economic development and integration. This necessitated the re-emergence of a concept of the African Renaissance, which is more of a possibility today than it has ever been before. This tourism may depend on the side you wish to see, but I wish to see it as an opportunity of a lifetime. On the one hand is the consideration of the current status of Africa. And funny thing, they don't look at Africa as a conglomeration of states, whether one is better than the other or not. They bundle everyone together and say we are an underdeveloped continent. The other side of the coin is the reality of the unlimited possibilities we have. I believe Africa still has more than 40% still untapped. In a few years, we will be the continent with the largest population on Earth. So we are the continent of the future. Taking this into consideration, let's look at a few things. It is said if you don't remember where you are coming from, you definitely don't remember where you are going. And maybe you'll never make it into the future. And so I want to start in the past. Iberian parable, when a person wants to plant or to make a new mat, you know, in our villages across Africa, mats that are made of bamboo and reed are usually what you will find on the floor. But if someone wants to make a new mat, they must sit on the old mat in order to make a new and a beautiful one. When you sit on the mat, you can actually see the patterns. You can see the colors. You can imagine what you want. It was formally introduced by former South African President Thabo Mbeki. First, in an address to the United States Corporate Council on Africa in April of 1997, and then subsequently here at home in Johannesburg, where he addressed an audience of about 500 persons from academia, from business, from politics. I believe President Mbeki's intention was to define the status quo and allow us to see where we actually were and bring the consciousness of those present to the need for a new African direction, which would define who were we, where were we going, and what would be our place. If one would search a little bit behind the scenes at this meeting, it would be clear to see that the main objective of the Johannesburg meeting was firstly an attempt to provide a critical understanding and the need to accept the reality of the dire circumstances of our continent. Secondly, to instill understanding and hope. That once you realize that you are in a difficult situation, you would then have the hope to correct it. Those present will begin to dream new dreams again. They will begin to conceive how to make those dreams come true, and they will be prepared to chart and lead the new way forward for an advanced agenda which will propel all of Africa to a position of an economically vibrant industrial continent, thus fully repositioning Africa into becoming a fierce competitor and an engine of growth and development. Then it was believed that it would be a win-win situation for all. If the choices that were to be made had been done at that period, who knows, we would be further ahead than we are today. The discussions held spoke about many things: the African agenda and the plans to instill sustained, inclusive economic growth across all the different spectrums. At this conference, former President Mbeki concluded his speech by saying, and I quote, "I am convinced that a great burden rests on the shoulders of Africa's intelligentsia, those who have been trained and capacitated to help us achieve these objectives. Remaining cognizant that we, Africans, have arrived at a point where the enormous brain power which our continent possesses would become a vital instrument in helping us secure an equitable space within the world body." End quote. His speech in Johannesburg at that point engendered the concept of a new mindset, coined the African Renaissance. History tells us that this was embraced by all at that conference. This new vision for a changed mindset was characterized by an emphasis on the new type of leadership needed to put this plan into effect and to succeed. What a vision for the realization of the African Renaissance that is the dream of our forefathers and the hope of our young people. But though this exciting conversation was held and the fire of a new world for Africans by Africans ignited, unfortunately, today we stand at 25 years hence. Most nations have remained only at this point of conversation. Though it is commonly said that there is nothing new under the heavens, I believe this conversation about the African Renaissance began many, many, many years before. During the liberation struggle, during the times that the different nations struggle for independence, and it continues unabated today through years of economic stagnation in most of Africa. For though our forefathers gave their blood and their sweat and their tears for Africa to be liberated, today, much of sub-Saharan Africa remains under the bondage of economic slavery. So much so that our young people only want to get out. They see greener pastures across the seas, and they are willing to volunteer themselves to migrate to foreign lands or to take on the seas in rickety boats to try to find a better life. The truth remains that those choices to migrate to other seemingly beautiful economies is just another form of slavery, howbeit it is voluntary slavery. At this juncture, the perennial question could be, so what is the hope for the future of Africa and Africans? But this question begs a lecture for another day. Our focus remains on the second issue for discussion. Where do we want Africa to be today? Thankfully, this question was adequately answered under the African Union's framework, Agenda 2063. The Africa we want. And I quote, "It is Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. It aims to deliver on its goal for inclusive and sustainable development and a concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and the list goes on and on. It prioritizes inclusive social and economic development, continental and regional integration, peace and security, with an attempt to reposition Africa to becoming a dominant player in a global arena. This Africa we want was missing something, and I want to add today that the Africa we want as women and girls is also a continent free from all forms of violence against women and girls. Freedom from violence paves the way to unlimited opportunities for full empowerment and preparation to continue the development of our beloved Africa. It has been said that women hold up half the sky. If 50% of our population is not fully engaged, bringing all of what we have to the table, then we are still far away from the Agenda 2063 that we hope to see. What then can we do to catapult Africa into the Africa we desire? I'm of the strong conviction that the most aggressive framework which will aid this forward march is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. According to the African Union, AfCFTA is a trade pact which will form the world's largest trade area by creating a single market for goods and services and technology of almost 1.3 billion people across Africa. What opportunities! It is estimated that this trade area could have a combined gross domestic product of around $3.4 trillion. I believe it is a tool for development. This tool aims to reduce tariffs, improve policy areas such as immigration and trade and services, and it will provide a regulatory framework which will improve the environments across Africa and set in place generally acceptable standards and regime, and reduce technical, legal, and physical barriers to trade. It is our hope that AfCFTA will take into consideration our centers of learning, our centers of innovation, our educational centers, to help create and certify the regimes that will be necessary, utilizing the young brains and the new technology that can jumpstart Africa's progress. I'm happy that most of the African nations and their leaders believe that AfCFTA is the tool for the African Renaissance. I'm happy today that President Thabo Mbeki is alive to see the next step of his conversation that began many years ago begin to take some shape. Many of our leaders believe that this is the way forward. His Excellency, the Secretary General of the AfCFTA Secretariat says, and I quote, "For Africa, the stimulus package is actually AfCFTA. The implementation of this agreement will increase intra-African trade, which will drive economic development post-COVID-19. Vera Songwe, Executive Director of the Economic Commission for Africa, states, "Africa does not need a Marshall Plan to ride out the ongoing coronavirus crisis. It has a more powerful tool, the AfCFTA, which we can use in accelerating regional and economic integration and prepare for uncertain times." President Nana Akufo-Addo, President of Ghana, states that the COVID pandemic has heightened the importance of the success of AfCFTA, a success that is now within our grasp, despite current challenges. The destruction of the global supply chains and the denial of Africa of what we actually needed must reinforce the necessity for closer integration amongst us so that we can boost our mutual self-sufficiency, strengthen our economies, and reduce our dependence on the outside world. Indeed, the AfCFTA is the right engine for the African Renaissance Africa so urgently needs. What are some of the benefits? It is said that the AFCTA will significantly reduce poverty. According to a recent World Bank report, this pact, if accepted by all of the countries, there are some who still have not signed, it will boost regional income by 7% or 450 billion. Speed up wage growth for women, and it will lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035. AFTA has positive economic outcomes, diversifying our export, helping us to integrate competitively into the world economy, increasing direct foreign investment, opportunities, broadening the economic inclusion, and other things are just a few of the things that will happen once the AFCTA comes into full force under a system where all of Africa and the governance processes accepts to use this as our tool. Of course, the one that is most important to me is that women stand to gain. AFTA focuses on improving the lives of women. There is a risk that some of the economic gains made by women could be reversed by COVID-19, but through special allocations and commitment to what we need to do to transform the opportunities for women, this provides a platform that women can use to become self-sufficient. Today, when you look across our borders and cross-border women trade, you'll find out how women are harassed. They are put through all kinds of violence. Sometimes their goods are confiscated. Sometimes they're even imprisoned. But the tariff reductions under the AFCTA will enable informal women traders to operate through formal channels, bringing them better protection and an opportunity to grow their businesses and develop. Trade integrity forms the center stage of this agreement. The negative impacts of COVID or any other pandemic that may come will be cushioned because it presents a short-term opportunities for countries to look at where we fell short during the COVID and cushion the effects of the pandemic by ensuring that Africa finally grows up and steps up to the plate to ensure that what we need in terms of vaccines, of medication, or innovation is done here on our continent. The benefits of cooperation from one state to the other will change the perception the world has of Africa, that we are just an underdeveloped continent. The trade agreement across Africa under the AFTA agreement will cushion our small mushrooming industries and give them the protection that they need to develop and grow. And there are many political dynamics that will help Africa get out of the woods and begin to stand on its own. While the world turns in one direction as a result of COVID and thinking about how they can protect themselves, the African Union, African states are moving closer together, deepening the ties across the continent, forging deep relationships that the developed world will take note of sooner rather than later. To come across Africa, those of us who live in West Africa, you have to go from our region to Addis Ababa to come to Malawi or to come to Southern Africa. There are many barriers that AFTA will break down to enable us to move across the continent and engage one another under a people-to-people sensitive framework that will enhance the opportunities and help all of us grow and develop into the continent that we all want to see. Your question would be, are there challenges to achieving this plan of action? There are many challenges, but life itself is a challenge. Families have challenges, communities have challenges, but those challenges do not stop us as parents from going out and making sure we're able to provide for our children, as universities for looking at the cutting edge possibilities and developing what we need, or as communities to forget about sovereignty and forget about us and look at everyone across the continent. There are some fears of the loss of sovereignty, fears of some tariffs that may be lost, maybe some uneven distribution of costs and benefits. People are worried about the political fragmentation. What would nation states lose? And the list goes on and on, especially when you look at the extenuating circumstances which currently exist: poverty, poor educational networks, diseases that most countries have long gotten rid of, violence, hunger, access to financing, and on and on. But these challenges can be overcome. Indeed, when I was growing up, I heard my mother say, challenges are just stepping stones which one can use to reach their goals. But in truth, the kind of reformation necessary for the radical shift which will produce the Africa we want under this framework needs a whole new breed of leaders with a new mindset. We need visionary leaders like we had in the past, looking beyond apartheid to a day when South Africa would have been free. We need aspirational leaders who have ambitious continental development agendas that are willing to see their countries transform in order to come together as one. We need exemplary leaders who would talk the talk of good leadership and lead by examples. We need agile leaders, young leaders, who are versatile and connected with the people, who are tuned to the solutions of the problems that have existed across our continent. We need compassionate leaders who genuinely care for their people and will always put the interests of their people first. We need honorable leaders. And there's a reason why elected leaders in many countries have the prefix title honorable before their names. It is based on a notion that such leaders are truly honorable men and women in spirit and in integrity and in deeds. Thank you. A truly honorable leader lives a life built on personal integrity, ethical values, good conscience, and convictions, who mean what they say and say what they mean. We need just leaders who are fair-minded, who believe in the rule of law and the tenets of equity and equality for all. We need selfless leaders who put the needs of their country first and do not suffer from the intoxicating spirit of vainglory and are not seduced by the material lures of power. These selfless leaders recognize that the ultimate judgment of a leader's life is not one of material wealth or naked power, but the kinds of legacies that you see today from people like Madiba, Nelson Mandela, and others. We need accountable leaders who are open to both self-evaluation and public scrutiny, who regularly engage with citizens and actively seek a feedback, changing to meet the needs of those they represent. These kinds of leaders, unfortunately, are mostly found in private spaces, and in the public spaces are few and far in between. But they can be found on the continent. These kinds of leaders have existed in the past. Former President Nelson Mandela, former President Kwame Nkrumah, and former President Nnamdi Benjamin Azikiwe of Nigeria and others. Sadly, you will find this kind of leader not in the political space where they are urgently needed. But the traits needed for the kinds of leaders we are talking about are found mostly in business and academia, and rarely at the political level, leaving one to ponder, how can we transition or shift such leaders from their apolitical convictions to active political roles? Or how can we groom the present generation to be so thus endowed? And that is a question for another lecture. Excellencies, honored guests, the Unisa family, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, when one considers all of what I've said, I can only say that the world we live in today indeed requires a new breed of African leaders who have a clear vision. They have knowledge and understanding of what it takes. The Bible says they were the sons of Issachar who understood the times and the seasons, who have wisdom and skills, and have character, who have uncommon commitment, dedication, Pan-Africanism, and integrity. Ones who would understand the crisis of our continent, and who are capable and willing to put aside their own personal needs and to place at the center of all of what we do the framework that will produce the African Renaissance, no matter the threats. Ones who are bold and audacious, ones who are straightforward and uncompromising in their roles to lead a team that is capable of building the Africa we urgently need. Because truth being told, time is no longer on our side. For if Africa must take advantage of this golden opportunity to step up and finally seize the moment to become the continent of our present, all of our leaders must in unison harness all of the potentials and make the shift necessary for this success story. As a Pan-African, I believe that this is possible, and it's possible today. My prayer is that these discussions will ignite the fire of the liberation struggles of our past, which was like a raging fire from nation to nation, which burned to the hearts and the heads and the hands of our leaders, both young and old, both male and female, who were determined that they would do all they could to obtain their freedom, or they would die in the process. This shift that we're talking about takes that kind of surreal commitment from all of us, regardless of where you stand. In closing, permit me to leave you with two quotes that I believe, though they were spoken in life, still echoes to us from the grave. From Madiba Nelson Mandela, which is apt for my closing. The first is to African visionaries. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free and the right not to be oppressed. We have not yet taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedoms of all others. This is the true test of our devotion to the freedom that we need. And the second quote is to those who are afraid of taking the difficult choices. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates many others, end quote. For me, both quotations spell the fact that if African leaders are willing, they can today change the trajectory that our continent is going with the new opportunities that are so readily available all around us. They can each work together to make Africa the powerhouse of the present and finally bring to fruition the dreams of our forefathers for a robust, productive, and empowered continent. That choice is for each of us as we play our roles in the societies where we lead. The time is now. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Wow, that was powerful. Great. Can we give her another? Yeah, I cannot even try to summarize what she said, because to do so would really be to spoil that oratory, the message, the inspirational message that she delivers to us, taking us back to the history of the concept of Renaissance and the main protagonist of this concept of Renaissance, bringing in the issue of dreaming about the future and preparing for the future. The contribution that this concept of Renaissance can bring to empowering, especially those people who have been in the marginalized side of society, the women and the youth. Just so much to share. And of course, when it goes to issues around the kind of leadership we want, quite a big menu there: inspirational leadership, agile leadership, and most importantly, the concept of ethical leadership with integrity. I think that just touched my heartstrings very, very strongly. And we really are very thankful for that powerful speech presented to us by Her Excellency Chief Dr. Joel Howard Taylor. Before I proceed with my task of facilitating the question and answer, I have been requested to request respectfully the Vice Chancellor, Professor Puleng Lengabula, to, together with Her Excellencies, step up to the podium so that Professor Lengabula can give a token of appreciation to our guest speaker. So respectfully, I'm asking that, and then of course it will also give us the opportunity for a bit of photo opportunities. Thank you very much. Oh. Thank you very much. With all of that excitement, I even forgot to introduce myself. But my colleague, Professor Paswana, did the initial introduction, and so I don't really feel that bad. My name is Matuhu Thomas Mohale. I am the Executive Dean of the College of Economic and Management Sciences, one of the big colleges in the university in student numbers, and of course staff complement. We are one of 8 colleges in Unisa family, and so my task this afternoon or this evening is to facilitate the question and answer session. And I'm going to ask our discussants to ascend to the podium and be comfortable in these 2 chairs. I'm going to start with Professor Dirk Gotze, who is who's lecturing at Unisa since the beginning of 1998 in the Department of Political Science. His most important areas of specializations are South African politics and political conflict resolution. It includes focus areas such as negotiations, transitions and democratization processes, elections, the quality of democracy, political cartoons, international relations, land reform, and political parties. He is a professor in the Department of Political Sciences here in Unisa. Professor Kotse, if you could just ascend to the floor. The next discussant is Professor Moyarao Diana Maganu. She was the recipient of the Woman of the Year Award in 2014 for community service. She's a full professor in the Department of Psychology in Education and is acting executive director for tuition support and facilitation of learning in this university. She was the chairperson of Education Association of South Africa. She is the chairperson of Unisa Women's Forum. She's co-edited books and book chapters and has published articles and conference proceedings and supervised 27 students, MND students to completion. Professor Maganu is an editorial board member of the South African Journal of Education, ESA, journal which is based at the University of Pretoria. Her niche area is wellness. Professor Maganu. And the next discussant is Mr. Kaya Sitole. I was with him in the holding room, but I don't see him now. Oh, okay, there he is. Kaya is an accountant, an academic, and an activist. He writes and he tweets on subjects such as finance, economics, and politics. Mr. Kaya Sitole, please come to the podium. Thank you very much, and a word of appreciation and thankfulness for your availability to be a discussant. The rules of the game are that I will give each of the discussants no more than 10 minutes to reflect on the presentation as given by our keynote speaker. And whilst they are doing the presentation, members of the audience may also just pen 1 or 2 questions that they feel they would like to ask any one of the discussants as they do their presentation here. And so, without much ado, I'll start with Professor Kotze to give us his impression and the way forward.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and ladies and gentlemen also. I think first of all for me, this topic and this whole evening poses a lot of challenges. I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat, I'm an academic. And I'm going to approach it from that point of view, and that means that I'm not necessarily going to be politically correct also, but rather to say what is the challenges that it poses for us here at Unisa as part of our broader mandate, but also intellectually and academically. What is it that we should focus on and respond to when we look at especially these 2 elements, the African Renaissance on the one hand, and then the African Free Trade Agreement, and the free trade area that's supposed to be established by this. I think, first of all, the idea of the African Renaissance has been, for some time now, a bit on the back burner. It hasn't been as prominent as it has been in the 2000s, especially with President Mbeki, who was very much in South Africa, the person who kept it on the agenda for most of the time. The African Renaissance, incidentally, it's a French word, although we are using it here, and very much associated with European Renaissance also. And that in itself created a debate in the 2000s about the appropriateness of the word that we are using. It's about renewal, it's about rebirth, it's about the assertiveness of the continent. It's about departing from the notion of dependency that existed for many years, especially during the time of the legacy of colonialism in general, and its reliance on external support and donations. And it presented, therefore, Africa as a continent which is supposed to stand on its own feet, and is supposed to develop an assertiveness and the self-confidence that was not always there in the past. At the same time, from a political point of view, it emphasizes the notion of democratization. Also the notions of the rule of law, of constitutionalism, of elections, as the basis of a political community or political society in general. In some cases, sometimes instead of referring to the Renaissance, the idea of the African agenda or the African century was words or concepts that were used as almost synonymous with that. In more concrete terms, the African Renaissance, I would say, if one has to summarize it for someone who doesn't know what it is about, first of all, in terms of characteristics, I would say I would start with the African Union, established in 2002, as very much a personification or as a way of presenting the African Renaissance in more concrete terms. Together with that, institutions like, for example, NEPAD, the African peer review mechanism, were all regarded or still are regarded as part of this African Renaissance. And then also the different charters and conventions that were adopted by the African Union and others that promotes, for example, democracy, elections, the prevention of unconstitutional changes of government, which introduced a new generation of values for the African continent in general and the members of the African Union, and for us as citizens, as people on the ground. I think also something which is very much associated with the African Renaissance is the access that developed between President Mbeki and President Obasanjo of Nigeria. They became, in a sense, representative of this new sense of assertiveness, of confidence, of also saying, we are responsible, for example, to deal with conflict resolution on the continent. Unfortunately, we lost that. You know, there isn't anymore that type of cooperation between the main leaders of the African continent at that level. I've seen it myself how later on President Mbeki and Obasanjo still continue, even up to today, to have that type of relationship, which I think is at this stage called for, but to a large extent absent on the African continent. Now, what are some of the most important moral, the most important characteristics of the African Union? First of all, moral renewal. I think it's a very important aspect of it about the idea of establishing or returning to certain values. Also political and economic transformation, and that brings us back very much to the topic that we are talking about in terms of an African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And other aspects, like for example, development of science and technology. We have the Deputy Minister here, which is part of the portfolio is science and technology. From an African Renaissance point of view, it is critically important. And we've seen it, and the Vice President referred, for example, to the vaccination situation during COVID-19. I think both President Ramaphosa, as well as other leaders of the continent, really demonstrated and started to insist on to what extent science and technology must be used for all sorts of purposes, including healthcare and, for example, the development of vaccinations. Now, to come back to, or to move on to the second part, I have only 10 minutes, is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, let's be a little bit, think out of the box. The free trade area is sort of the second step, if we go back to the Lagos plan of action, which set out how Africa must integrate at a regional level, but even at a continental level. First, a customs union, secondly, a free trade area, then an economic community, and ultimately a monetary union. So we are with this in step 2. At the same time, and I think we need to have a careful look at this, this is about globalization. Let's be honest about it. You know? Now, globalization is not necessarily a very popular concept on the African continent, you know, because it is ideologically loaded. You know? And it's sometimes ideologically loaded, very often in a sort of a neoliberal sense. You know? And is this what we are dealing with? And I think there is a spontaneous embracement of the idea of a free trade area, but it has implications. And I'm not always sure if the notion and the ideals of the Renaissance and the practice of a free trade area on the African continent are going to meet each other. Because for a free trade area to be able to function, it needs to have economies that are more or less harmonized. You can't have a very strong economy having free trade relations with a very small economy. It's going to seriously harm that smaller economy. So in the example that's being used, which is the model of this, is obviously the European Union. There, the Copenhagen criteria is being used for harmonization to make it sure that economies of more or less the same scale can work together. You know? This we don't have. All members of the African Union are, by implication, members of the free trade area, although only 30 members actually ratified it. So that is the first point. The second point is a free trade area does not work when all the members of that free trade area produce the same products. Like, for example, in our case, concentrate on agriculture and minerals, oil and others. So it means that the free trade area will only make sense if the economies are diverse, if they have become diverse so that some countries have a competitive edge in one type of product and the other country in the other one, so that interaction in terms of trade and exports and imports can happen. What also should be, and this is a very tough question for the current developments internationally, is that free trade areas cannot work when there's economic nationalism. When you say South Africa first, Angola first, Zambia first, whichever country, America first. That means it's an inward type of nationalism which works directly against the notion of free trade areas. And lastly, a tough one is, for free trade areas to work, it must allow also for the free flow of persons between countries. That means that foreign nationals must be able to move between states. And given the xenophobic situation in many countries, the resistance against foreign nationals within economies, it's a tough task for a free trade area to be able to work. So in conclusion, I would say free trade areas are going to, and the Continental one here, will most possibly in the short run benefit stronger economies. The challenge is going to be what's going to happen with the weaker economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Magano.
Thank you, Program Director. And I want to also thank Her Excellency, the Vice President. I just want to say you touched my heart, and you really made me to think of who an African is. The point that you made on economic slavery, we are made to migrate to foreign countries. The main thing that is causing that, Your Excellency, is that we've forgotten who we are. And today's lecture is appropriate to take us back to our true selves as Africans and to restore our African identity. As a specialist of wellness, I just want to say we have been stripped of our emotional, our intellectual, our social, our career wellness. The quilt that was made here as a gift, it's what the Africans are capable of. But today, we buy from those who took from us. And these are the injustices of colonialism. We are made to be slaves in our own country. We have even forgotten that our names are Bomuyahabo. I say I'm Dinah. What's that? It means we have forgotten who we are. I see African continental free trade area reversing the elitism that is there in academia, in economy. There is that element of individualism. Instead of focusing on the African values of togetherness, we talk of foreigners. Who's a foreigner in Africa? That is the question that we should be asking ourselves. So I want to continue to look at academia. What is the role of academia? What is the role of higher education and basic education? Honorable Deputy Minister, you are here today to help us to reverse the elitism in our education system and to look back at our roots, to look back at what was thrown away, which was good. I remember when I was at primary school education, there was skills economy in our education system. We were taught handwork. That was skills economy. Come 1994, the handwork that we were taught, which was promoting skills economy, was thrown away. We were looking forward to white-collar professions. You look at our graduates, you look at the percentage of unemployment of the very same graduates that we are producing is very high. Are we producing graduates who will be roaming in the street, who will be thinking of robbing banks? Higher education, basic education, we need to find the real skills economy in our country. These were pointed out by Chase Jarvis, is saying skills economy will be realized in innovation, art, writing, designing, and being creative. Can we restore that back into our education system? I proceed to look at the plight of women. When we see unemployment in the country, who is the hardest hit people? Women and children. If funding is availed for women, for young people, we know that our country will not have a high rate of crime, unemployment. So let our government be true leaders, as our Excellency has alluded to be visionary leaders, selfless leaders, and not to empower only those who are in high positions, but to make sure that Africa, with its own people, we share equally. Furthermore, I want to talk about empowerment in digital literacies. There is a dire need that we need to move on with the globe. In the rural areas, we know that there are areas where we don't even have access. You can be given a laptop, but it's so difficult to be connected. So what are we doing with our young people who are in those rural areas? That ties to the digital economy across the continent. For us to be able to trade online freely in Africa, we need that digitalization. Another element which comes from the African roots and values is the power of cooperative economy. There's a book written by Madumezulu, who is taking us back to our social cohesion, to the who we are. In Sesotho, we say Lichima. When we want to plow the field, we go as a group, and we know that in one day, that field will be cultivated. Let's go back to our roots of cooperative economy, working together, not sell apples, but we say, as a group, as a cooperative, what can we do? From Cape to Cairo, we have the value system of working together. I am because you are. The point that I want to put emphasis is on educational renaissance in Africa. I'm reminded of Lumumba Kasongo, who was here last week, Tefo and Siepe and Vilagazi. They say much of what is taken for education in Africa is in fact non-African, but rather a reflection of Europe in Africa. Let the educational renaissance in Africa bring the real identity of who we are in the spirit of working together, recentering the human being. Now, when the human being element is not there in our education system, who are we fooling? What are we doing? Now, recentering the who we are in the education system, we are going to go far. The last point that I want to make in closing, exchanging knowledge amongst African institutions. is still lacking. And this is where we are going. I'm happy that the VC spoke about that, and also Her Excellency spoke about that. Student exchange and academic exchange programs, where an academic from Unisa will be taken to Liberia University to lecture psychology or political science, and also vice versa, and across the whole institution. In that way, we will be making sure that the African knowledge is spread across, and we are actually doing the rebirth or the renaissance in Africa. In achieving the Agenda 2063, I want to point aspiration number 6, which is saying, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. I thank you, Program Director.
Thank you, Professor Mahano, for those comments. I'm now going to proceed on to Kaya to give us his own thoughts.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. Good evening to you, Your Excellency. The African conundrum and the great problem with the African progress and African Renaissance is that at every turn we've been interrupted by the buccaneers, the barbarians, the colonialists, the capitalists, and more recently by ourselves. And our lack of ambition has been fatal to the progress of the African continent. And I want to give you a couple of anecdotes of how I come up to that particular realization. The idea of Africa trading with itself, the idea of a continent being a singular economic zone, is an idea that is quite old, and I think a lot of people tend to make the mistake of associating the concept of Cape to Cairo with Cecil John Rhodes. It actually wasn't Cecil John Rhodes who coined the idea of Cape to Cairo. It was Edwin Arnold a couple of years earlier, who, in his masquerading ways with Henry Morton Stanley, when they were traveling through Africa, trying to sort of allocate parts of it to Queen Victoria, he came up with the idea that, well, perhaps the British cause would be better served if they could essentially be able to travel throughout the continent and take whatever they needed to extract from the continent. And that particular idea was obviously based on ill-conceived intentions, which was to extract and take away from Africa. However, in recent years, when we then look at what we seek to achieve as an entire continent, there's been a universal realization for many, many years that it is probably better if we start trading with each other rather than past each other, or even in some instances against each other. So when I then talk about how we, through our collective sense of inertia, have actually defeated those particular ideas, I take you back to 1988 in particular. And in 1988, we talk about the Yamoussoukro Declaration, which simply says, look, as an African continent, we now acknowledge that the way of travel is the aviation way. So we need to be able to ensure that if a person wants to travel from Monrovia to Johannesburg, they can get into a plane overnight and they could be here in the morning. We need to be able to enable the same idea from somebody traveling from Windhoek all the way up to Lagos. And the problem that then emerges in that in the truncated story of how we all reach post-colonial states and how we all reach freedom at different parts, what each country was then endeavoring to do was to say, let us create our own legacy airline and therefore make it protected. And that protectionist stance, which is similar to what Professor Coates was talking about now, the idea of nationalism, that protectionist stance then started creating an aviation sector where everybody sought to capitalize and extract the greatest profits out of it. And then it suddenly became very clear that for people to travel within Africa was quite simply unaffordable. So African leaders sit around in 1988 and then they decide that we need to do this thing differently. And they give themselves particular timelines, and then they say, if we are able to open up the skies of Africa, we are going to deal with the absurdity of, if I want to end up in Morocco tomorrow, I actually have to fly to Paris first. If I want to end up in Mali, I have to leave Johannesburg and get to Paris and then come back. And the reason I have to go to Paris is that for some bizarre reason, there is much greater air traffic between Togo, between Ivory Coast, between Senegal and France than there is between those countries and Johannesburg, which is a great absurdity of our time. And yet, in spite of that acknowledgement and the reality that Africa and African continent makes up more than 15% of the global population, the African continent only accounts for 1% of the aviation sector, of the aviation economic value chain. In other words, if we wanted everybody in Africa to be able to access this, we'd actually be now voluntarily exporting our hard-earned rands and dollars and francs all to these other foreign airlines and to those foreign countries. And why that becomes important is that we spoke earlier on about, old forms of slavery where people were then forced into doing particular things. Now, the fact that we are failing to solve some of the simple economic problems is that we're simply actually still achieving the same outcomes that Cecil John Rhodes had, which was to extract from Africa. Because if I have to pay Air France or KLM in order for me to end up in Africa, the great economic value chain is being exported so that I can go to my neighbor. That is the current absurdity that we're dealing with now. So when you then look at the fact that from 1988 up until now, we still do not actually have that declaration being realized into law, it indicates a lack of ability for us to apply our collective insights as a continent to say, this is what we need to do in order to achieve economic freedom for Africa. Whether one calls that a renaissance or whatever other term you use, that is the point that we're trying to get to. But perhaps it is more acutely captured in the essence of what happened in Maputo in 2013. So almost 10 years ago, African leaders again congregate, and then they look at the question of, wait, hold on, we've got an agrarian problem in Africa, we've got an agricultural problem in Africa in that we have got vast volumes of arable land, we've got this growing population, and food insecurity still persists. How has that come to be? And the declaration, the Maputo Declaration of 2013, simply says that as the African continent, we will now endeavor to ensure that we spend at least 10% of our national budgets, national GDP, on the agricultural sector. And the reason that sector was quite important is that it is a grassroots sector that captures the fact that over 70% of rural Africans depend on agriculture for their ability to live from day to day. So it is a critical sector that ensures not only that people can live, but it may be the difference between abject poverty and death overnight. So in 2013, we signed the Maputo Declaration, and everybody says that within 5 years, we need to get to 10% of national budgets being spent on agriculture. If you go and look at the research today and you ask yourself, if you put on Google, how many Africans currently are food insecure? How many Africans, as of today, are unsure about where their next meal is going to come from? The answer is 281 million. 281 million from a population of 1.2, now approaching 1.3 billion. That is a huge deficit. That is a huge problem. And the simple question is, if everybody formed the collective view 9 years ago that this is what needed to be done in order for us to be... Sorry, why do I keep saying 2013? It was actually 2003. 2003. If everybody formed that view that this is what needed to be done in order to solve the problem of food insecurity in South Africa, the reason we haven't reached it yet is simply because all of us sitting in the room, all of us sitting in similar rooms across the African continent, haven't actually activated our own agenda. And when we start talking about long-term agendas like the NDP in South Africa, Agenda 2063 across the continent, it is impossible not to laugh at all of these things, because at every single step where we are then asked to account for how we're living up to the commitments that we've made ourselves, we are collectively failing ourselves. And that is the essence of the problem that we have currently. A couple of years ago, I think perhaps the single most embarrassing episode occurred when there's a pandemic, and we suddenly discovered that in an entire continent of over 1 billion people, there actually isn't a facility ready to manufacture vaccines. It was inconceivable to think about that. And then, of course, there was then the secondary problem that we stumbled upon, which was the intellectual problem, in that even in instances where vaccines were being developed, it then turned out that South Africa, I keep saying South Africa, mainly because somebody accused the Excellency of being the Vice President of South Africa earlier on. So I've been stuck with that ever since. It then turned out that we couldn't even convince other countries in the middle of a pandemic to waive their intellectual property rights so that we could save lives. That, for me, represented the great problem of a continent with over 1.2 billion people, in other words, making up a significant part of the global population, being taken so flippantly and being regarded as so irrelevant that pharmaceutical companies could simply say, we're not going to do that. If Africa's got a problem, they must fix it themselves. The World Trade Organization, ironically, is the institution where that conversation was happening. And I remember trying to highlight it to some people in the healthcare industry to say, look, perhaps the way you're approaching the conversation is flawed in many respects. And I gave them the Indian example. The Indian example is that in 1997, when the World Trade Organization is put together, and it simply says we must, equalize and neutralize the way things are done, one of the big challenges that big European and American countries came up with was the fact that subsidies, agricultural subsidies, distorted the market. So therefore, it was very clear that those subsidies must be abolished. And if those subsidies were going to be implemented, countries must be punished. So India then goes back, and then they say, look, unfortunately, we've got a 1 billion problem. The 1 billion problem that India has is that 1 billion of its citizens are dependent on agriculture. The rudimentary nature of the agriculture sector in India is that very few of those farmers and farms could ever be profitable on a standalone basis. So in the absence of subsidies, there's actually zero food production that happens in India. So they simply said to the World Trade Organization, everybody else can abolish their subsidies. We are not going to sacrifice 1 billion of our citizens simply because somebody's written the rules that are appropriate to them. That was in 1997. So you get to the TRIPS waiver conversation a couple of years ago, and then I'm asking the question, wait, hold on. If India could get that conversation to be understood at that level many years ago, what are the type of leaders that we're sending to actually explain these things on our behalf in 2022 in the middle of a pandemic? If they can't even explain and articulate something that simple, that in the absence of these waivers being implemented, people are going to lose lives. And that, for me, reflected as some of the problems that Africa needs to start confronting. In that, in far too many instances, we believe in this idea of legacy leadership. From a rural KZN town where legacy leadership is the answer. The questions on who ought to lead are not based on the question of what are you leading for. If you're trying to lead a society into getting into a new paradigm, if you're trying to lead a society that must migrate from, primary factors of production to intellectual factors of production, then the person that ought to lead is the person that can execute on that mandate, not the person who happens to have been born as an accident of history a few years ago. So the sum of those particular issues are something that when 2018 happened, and I use 2018 as the reference point, is that only when the Secretariat of the Continental Trade Agreement was put into place did I believe that we're actually going to start moving forward. So when you then look at what happened in 2018, for me, it should have been the moment where all these standalone conversations, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in aviation, whether it's in healthcare, all those conversations could now be actually consolidated into one singular entity that said we're having an African conversation rather than 54 different conversations with limited bargaining power across different multinational institutions. So the great hope that I had in 2018, which was the new dawn as far as I was concerned, not the other one that you guys know about, was simple the fact that at that point in time, we're going to capitalize on our collective clout as a continent to start negotiating better in order to get more optimal outcomes. Because in the absence of that, none of these ideas that we've been talking about since 2002, whether you're talking NEPAD, whether you're talking the African Renaissance, none of these ideas are ever going to get us to anywhere close to the agenda ideas that we have for 2063. And the problem is not that we are not going to get them. The problem is that by the time that time frame arrives, it will be your children that pay the price for your inability to run this continent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kaya, for that provocative statement at the end. But now, if you have questions, not statements, please, you can raise one or two questions to our discussants. Yes, I see a hand there. Yes. And of course, there's another one that side. The gentleman with a gray, black shirt. All right, please go proceed.
All right, thank you very much to the panel, to the Vice President. My name is Christopher Isike. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Pretoria. I just wanted to ask the panelists here right now whether they think that the African Renaissance, should include rethinking, and repurposing the states in Africa. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because the state as we know it in Africa is not an African state. It's an imposed state that was designed for, exploitation. And it produces a notion of governance that is parasitic. And these are the notions of states that we have carried on since then. So, should part of the discussion of African Renaissance include the elephant in the room, that is rethinking the state itself so that we can repurpose it for our own benefits?
Thank you, Prof. And the gentleman on the other side, right up there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon me to but nonetheless, I'd like to ask the panelists there. My question will be directed Prof. Kotze and I've forgotten Prof. Story. Prof. First, my question with regards to African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that why it is having implications when it comes to trading to Africa. When I check with China, for instance, most of our merchandise that we wear are made in China, in the People's Republic of China. And secondly, the African Continental Free Trade, it also has implications. Why is it that Africa still has the so-called Economic Structural Adjustment Program? We actually loan funds from IMF, Britain Institution, World Bank to come and fund our organization, and then we expect ourselves to run. How do we do so? Secondly, why is it that on the public participation, it is not declared that youth can participate? For instance, you find your members of parliament, some of them, they are above the age of 65, 75. They are old people and are regarded as members of parliament, whereas in my point of view, it has been declared that they have to be taking a pension. Their working period has expired. You understand? And you have youth here whom are seeking jobs, chanting, going to universities, implementing funds in their higher learning institutions, forgetting that these youths cannot get a job while we still have MPs who are over age there, and yet they still orchestrating and having their position. Now,
Sorry, what's the question?
my question, I posed 4 questions to Prof. Kotze. First, it's about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that why it is difficult for us to maneuver it, whereas we're still having a trading with China. For instance, we're wearing merchandise which are made in China, but then they cannot wear merchandise which is made in Africa. Secondly, why? Okay, I'll make an example. In Congo, there's a cobalt which makes our smartphone. Everybody's having an Apple. That cobalt is mined in Congo, but it is manufactured in China or USA. Yet we still having that African Continental Free Trade cannot succeed. In which terms, whereas we are having certain things which are succeeding, which are from Europe. You understand?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
thank you.
Thank you, sir. There's one question here, and then you can answer 3 questions. There was one question, his question, and the third question, and then I'll have another round after that, so we don't forget the questions.
Thank you so much, Program Director. 2 things that were mentioned were specifically regarding the fact that You know, just 2 days ago, we were trying to book a holiday to Cape Verde Islands. And we couldn't go directly to Cape Verde Islands from South Africa. We have to go to Portugal, Turkey, or some other random country before we can come back from South Africa. We have to go out of the continent, then come back to the Cape Verde Islands. That was the first thing. The second thing that Kaya spoke about at the end was regarding the age issue. And my question essentially is, we are raised as African children to respect our elders, to sort of get the wisdom from our elders. But when we're dealing with a continent with a majority population of young people, and we have elders who are refusing to vacate seats of power when they have no fresh ideas, and they cannot relate to young people. And I don't mean this in an ageist or disrespectful manner, but you have elders who've been leading countries since 1970 something, 1980 something. You are dealing with a 2000 who is on TikTok as a president. What is going through your head as a leader? What are we supposed to do? Bearing in mind the fact that we are African children, we're supposed to respect our elders. What, as an elder, are you thinking when you are refusing to vacate a seat when children, you can't relate to these children? You can't run the country in a manner in which serves your children, your grandchildren. My question to the panel is, what are we supposed to do as African children in that sense?
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll give the panelists the opportunity to respond to those three questions. Any one of you can pick it up?
All right, thank you. I will deal with just one question, and that is the question of the perverse economics of aviation. So unfortunately, as it turned out, the aviation sector is a rather lucrative sector for governments that have an aviation sector, because anecdotally, the type of people that use that service are not the poor. It's people who are either part of the formal economy, are able to work and therefore able to afford it. So what you then do is that in that economic modeling, whatever additional taxes and tariffs you can add onto that, it becomes an easy source of revenue for a lot of governments. So the problem with that is that unfortunately it then makes the idea of viability of a lot of airlines within the continent very, very difficult to achieve. And if you are going to travel, for example, trying to get from Namibia to South Africa to Botswana to Zimbabwe, you get different answers for how much it costs for you to be able to essentially travel to those places. So that perverse nature of aviation economics is even more acute in the African continent, given the very limited indigenous air traffic, if I might call it that, and the fact that so many airlines would simply be unviable in any other model simply means that they simply do not operate. So when you don't have enough air traffic within your continent, you then end up having to deal with all those strange things of flying back and forth. So quite interestingly, in 1988, that was a big point of deliberation, because when it comes to how the aviation sector works, we talk about the freedom rights. And the freedom rights simply mean that if an aeroplane is flying from Cairo, in order to get to Johannesburg, can it stop in Dakar, Senegal, and pick up passengers? And if those rights are free, it then simply means that that airline will say, we had half capacity when you left Egypt, we'll fill it up when you get to Senegal, so therefore we can fly the aeroplane. If, however, those freedom rights are not universally accessible, in other words, it's expensive for you to even lend them, then that airline may simply say, well, we'll simply bypass the Senegalese population. So now the Senegalese cannot get to Johannesburg. They then have to piggyback on an airline like Air France or KLM, go to Paris, because the Parisian airline simply says, no, we can definitely afford to fly straight to Johannesburg. And that is the problem that we've had. The irony, of course, is that when you then look at what the Continental Trade Agreement deals with, it does deal with the question of lucrative tariffs, if I can call it that. So the model simply says that in the immediate term, we seek to abolish 90% of trade barriers in the forms of tariffs. Then we're going to move to the 7% one, and then the 3% one caters for the fact that some countries, once you tell them to abolish that singular traffic, which is a source of revenue for them, they would simply stop being viable. So what this trade agreement has tried to do is try to find a balance in dealing with these artificially high barriers. But that on its own, it's been 4 years down the line, it hasn't liberalized the aviation sector, for example. It hasn't dealt with the question of why it's still cheaper to buy merchandise from China. It hasn't dealt with the question of why it's still more sensible for companies that want to sell you a gold ring to dig it up in South Africa, send it off somewhere else, and bring it back. And perversely, it doesn't deal with that strange phenomenon of Nigeria being an oil producer that cannot use its own oil because they have to send it somewhere else for someone to bring it back to them.
Thank you. Right. And any other response? Yes, Prof?
Chair, from my side, there's a number of questions. Professor Isike, I don't know, about the rethinking of the state. I think the logic of the idea of a free trade agreement is actually to make the state less significant. Because that means that the state is not anymore the deciding agent of what is the relationship and the flow of trade between different states. So in a sense, it moves over to the economy or to the private sector to determine the dynamics of trade between states or between different countries. Also, the idea of free trade agreements in the African context is started at the regional level. SADC, ECOWAS, East African Community, all of them have free trade agreements. I mean, I think the first convention or charter that was adopted by SADC was about a free trade agreement. That hasn't been implemented until very recently. So the notion of individual states as sort of the basis of free trade agreements to a large extent, I think, is underemphasized, because the very nature, the very rationale for free trade agreements is to reduce the impact of decision-making by states. And that is why I said earlier on, free trade agreements fit into this sort of this notion of globalization. What we've seen in the case of Brexit, for example, is actually exactly the opposite. When it comes then to, so the notion of the state and whether the state is in itself, in whatever form it is conceptualized or defined or exists in reality, I'm not sure whether that plays such an important role compared to other issues that where the state is involved. Whether this reference to China versus African trade, I think first of all we must just make sure that we have a sort of a common understanding of what a free trade agreement is. And I think many of us might have too high expectations of what a free trade agreement can do or free trade area can do. It is essentially about liberalizing trade between countries, and that is to remove the trade barriers that exist between countries in the form of tariffs. Incidentally, if you go to the documentation that governs the South Africa's involvement in the African Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the main agency? SARS. And that demonstrates how much tariffs is the driving force in the South African understanding of what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is about. We must also understand that there are African countries, take South Africa for example, have free trade agreements with many other countries in the world. China, there's African countries, South Africa for example, have free trade agreements with them. Many African countries have free trade agreements with the European Union. Almost, I think the first, after 1994, the first international agreement that was negotiated by the South African government was the free trade agreement with the European Union. But ironically, about 20% of all items that were excluded from it were agricultural items. So there wasn't a free trade agreement. On other issues they were. When it comes to the US, AGOA, the African Growth and Development Act, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, is in essence a free trade agreement. Again, it has implications about dumping of chicken and from the US on South Africa, all sorts. So it is not this perfect arrangement that many people would like to see in terms of it. But it means that the notion of free trade agreements is not only confined, let's say now, to the African group in terms of a free trade agreement. There's cross-cutting free trade agreements between all sorts of countries, and that includes almost all African countries also. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. I will take the first question on the African Renaissance. Does it include the rethinking? I want to say yes, I agree with you. There must be a paradigm shift. There's an author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is talking about decolonizing the mind and also moving the center. When the mind is heavily colonized, it is very difficult to think in an African way. We are global citizens, but what have you learned from the lower level to where you are as a professor or as an intellectual? There's a lot of what we have learned that is not African. You know the Mississippi River, but you don't know a river in Liberia. So what does that say? You study things that are not even close to you. Hence, you despise what is close to you and you respect what is far from you. Therefore, the paradigm shift, the education system, the history that is distorted need to be changed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mahano. And then there was a hand there. I'll just take two more. There's a hand there, and there's another hand.
There's another one here. Can I answer the political question?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Kama.
Before you start, who was the young lady that asked the political question? And the thing is that your generation makes up 60% of the population. There are some areas that democracy really doesn't exist. We must acknowledge that. And you have those systems that people stay for 40 and 50 and 60 years. And the systems just roll over and roll over. That may take death or something to have the systems change. But in most places, there is now democracy, which is in the hands of the young people. So I think across the continent, we must begin to collaborate and see how young people can begin to look at who's able to do what is necessary. Even young people, there's so many ideas that you have. You guys need to stand up and begin to be part of the process. Standing outside doesn't help. You have to get inside to be able to bring your own ideas to bear. So don't be discouraged. I think it's a process, and you will see that there are many young people now getting elected into parliament. So the new changes have started taking place that puts the development of your country and the forward thinking that you have on the table. Much more of that needs to happen, and I think it will help us begin to change. I would like to just thank my mother over there for reminding us that there is a whole shift that's necessary, and that's the truth. Colonialism intended to erase our memory, erase who we are. And if you read the story of those who came from West Africa, the first thing was to separate people. You know, if you came from one part of the continent, they made sure women and children were separated. So the disconnect has been a part of the DNA that we've been carrying. So who are we? You know, where do we start? At the beginning. And it may take us a little bit to get there, but you read much more about the West than you do about Africa. And I think that's where the changes need to take place, at the level of education, at the levels of our homes. What are our parents teaching us? Go back to the basic, and I think Africa can get to where we hope it will be in this short time that's available. Thank you.
Okay, we are we sort of under time constraints now. And unfortunately, I had hoped that we could give the two hands at the back, but I think we can engage and continue the conversation. There were no straight answers. There are still toes and fro's from this conversation that we have had here, and I think it's something that we will not be able to reach consensus on today. So my apologies for the two hands at the back. Unfortunately, I now have to give the Vice Principal, Tuition and Learning, to come and say a word of thanks.
Excuse, Prof. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and program directors. Thank you very much for steering the ship. I can see that it's a very, very lively discussion that we're having today, and I'm certain that the Vice-Chancellor is aware that certain voices had to stop because we have to mind the time, and I'm hoping that we shall have another time where we hear the voices that were stopped because of time. Madam Vice-Chancellor, I'll start with you because I'm standing here on your behalf. And through you, Madam Vice-Chancellor, thank you very much for this discourse for change. It is a fitting discussion that we're having today because it is one of those steps that we, as a continent, are taking in reclaiming our authority over what happened in the mid-1840s when 13 nations from Western Europe plus the USA sat down to draw some lines on the face of Africa. History tells us, Madam Vice-Chancellor, that prior to the Berlin conference, there was actually a pre-meeting with the kings and chiefs, which was somewhat diplomatic, but the subject of that meeting was trade. It was about asking how best Europe can trade with Africa. Africa was closed to that. It just did not allow anyone. Then Europe had to go back and then come back a few years later and just sit and design its own home over Africa through the Berlin Conference. I'm giving this history, ladies and gentlemen, for us to understand the context of the subject of free trade. We are discussing free trade because the continent is in shackles. The economic enterprise was bound. Therefore, we need to discuss how we can have it unbound, how we can be free to trade. What we used to have before was captured. The show that we saw of the gift to the University of South Africa's first citizen is a clear sign of what Africa was capable of doing. We had our salt industries, we had factories, we had schools, we had universities, we had everything. But there was a calculated move from Europe to manacle, to tame, to erase, to eradicate, to kill and destroy this continent. Therefore, if the primary mission was about getting trade into the hands of Western Europe, it is fitting, Madam Vice-Chancellor, for us to address the matter of freeing trade, because that's where, the matter of language, of education, these were mitigating strategies, but the key point is trade. I'll stop there. I'm not the keynote speaker. Madam Vice-Chancellor, allow me on behalf of the University of South Africa, on behalf of the Council of the University of South Africa, on behalf of executive management, on behalf of the students of the University of South Africa and staff to thank Her Excellency, Chief Dr. Jewel Howard Taylor. I've never cried in a lecture, ever. I clap hands. Today, I cried. Today, I cried because Your Excellency reminded us of this ethical leadership that we don't have. The leadership that does not look at money, the leadership that does not look at their own purse or their own prestige, but a leadership that looks at the community. Today, I cried. We thank you as a university. I would like to proceed. I'd like to proceed, not in any small measure, to thank His Excellency, the Honorable Deputy Minister in his absence. May I thank all the members of different cabinets in this room today. We feel very honored to have you. And their excellencies, the ambassadors, in their different portfolios. And I wish to say, let me kindly align myself with standing protocol. You all make Unisa very proud, and we are honored to have you all here. Ladies and gentlemen, I know which side my bread is buttered. I wish to thank members of council. They've been sitting here patiently. It is an honor, really, to share these moments with members of council, and I truly want to singularly honor you and appreciate your presence. And then, because we know the future, as Wole Soyinka says, every day I quote Wole Soyinka. The past is the river in which flows the present into the future. I wish to thank the young lions in this house. Really, we need you. We need to hear your voices. And we know that you cannot rush the rains before they come. So mark your time. You will have your time in Parliament. Just grow. Just grow. And we truly appreciate your presence. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks go to the Department of Institutional Development for arranging this this occasion, and all the colleagues who have worked very hard in bringing together this particular occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have you as a university. Merry Christmas, and please enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutsa Madikani. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end. Just wait where you are. Just a second. Just a second. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this evening. And from Professor Mohale and myself, we want to thank you for being a wonderful audience this evening. We are all going to stand as we allow the dignitaries to leave the place, the podium. And please, we have some nice and goodies, third floor from here. So please, before you go home, just step this way up through there's stairs and lifts. Please go to the third floor. You will see what Unisa has for you. We know it's late for some of you to have something, but please, this will be fruitless expenditure without you. So at this point in time, I will ask all of us to stand up as we allow. Just keep standing where you are until the dignitaries leave the room, and then the rest of us can go. Thank you. From Unisa, we wish you all traveling mercies back home. Thank you.